Hi, this is Amir Ullah Khan. I am a development economist and I have a great deal of interest in looking at popular culture and how that reflects in the Indian economy. Towards that, we will today discuss the evolution of liberal ideas, especially in Hindi cinema. In the first section, let us look at what liberalism means in the context of art and culture in the country. So, what does liberalism imply? Who is a liberal? Why am I a liberal? Why are you sitting in this liberalism class? To be liberal is to be accommodative. To be liberal is to understand dissent. To be liberal is to understand that evolution, civilization happens because of our ability to look at various ideas. This definition is important for the context that I want to set in discussing Hindi cinema. The importance and the ability to understand various conflicting ideas. In my opinion, this sentence really defines Indian cinema. Over the last 120 years, with thousands of films being produced and mainstream commercial cinema, we have seen this underlying aspect across filmmakers and across films that we have made and seen. Let's start at the very beginning. The cinema, when it began in India, uh, showed people some fascinating sights, which today might appear very mundane. But the first set of movies that came were movies that were titled A Train Coming into a Platform. Why was this the definition of something transformative? Because here were people sitting and looking at technology, marveling at it, and understanding that there is a world out there that is quite different from theirs. In a traditional country set in folklore, set in mythology, set in custom, the ability to grasp this complete change, this idea of something that was so different from what one sees around, was itself the definition of liberal. Cinema, even when it began, started off by taking up such a wide variety of conflicting issues, of issues that would shake up society, that it was a medium that even when it began was telling people that look, watch out for this medium. It is going to change the way you are going to look at society and at yourself. So why do I say that? Because you see what happens is that cinema starts predictably with Indian cinema starts after the initial flurry of technology and trains and whatever. It starts off by mythological films like Raja Harishchandra, goes on to make the first talkie called Anamara. Here were subjects that were chosen for the fact that they were revolutionary subjects. There was Harishchandra who was caught in this conflict between what is true and what is not true, what is truth and what is falsehood. There were these fantastic films or fantasy films that were made that were telling people about a world that was beyond their comprehension. Each time a movie was made, it was testing people on what they thought was possible, what they thought was plausible, and what they thought was pure fantasy. Even in the early days of cinema, the directors and the producers were testing new grounds, and they were making films that were so surprising and so iconoclastic that the British government actually had to bring in a very strict censorship law. The censorship law that we see today is actually a British construct where it was considered important to control this mechanism or this medium that the British government thought could actually become very seditious. So in the 30s and 40s, you see a lot of films being made which contest the idea of what freedom means and what foreign struggles are. To do that in an age when there was a foreign ruler who could have used any method possible to stop such a message. It was very interesting that such a drastic approach was used. As we approach India's independence, we find films like Shaheed being made, which actually start talking about the life of somebody who gives up his career, his youth for the country, and therefore a sense of daredevilry, a sense of adventure, a sense of being strong enough to question authority comes up, which in a lot of ways is the hallmark of what liberalism means. You have a film called Waqt, which is made later, where Balraj Sahni sings that famous song "O Meri Zohra Jabi," which itself is a manifestation of being liberal. But the film itself starts off in pre-partition India and talks about the whole concept of partition, the whole gruesome episode that left thousands of people dead, in a very lyrical, in a very poignant manner, which again is something that underlines the fact that here is one strong popular culture that allows people to live difficult times and go back to a nostalgic past without rancor. Uh, if you go back and see what a liberal idea or liberal ideas really mean, it is the ability to do so. It is the ability to visit historical facts objectively. It is the ability to look at historical wrongs objectively. Unlike what we see in illiberal societies, where what is done 200 and 300 years ago is raked up to construct a violent present. That is what we see in the cinema that happens immediately after independence. What we then observe is something pretty exciting and pretty interesting, and for which one must give credit to the filmmaker of early independent India, who presciently looked at what Indian society is going to go through, and it kind of preempts the political economy. And films made in the 50s start talking about clashes between owners of capital, labor, land reform, the issue of wages, and the issue of franchise, which is something that even serious literature would not attempt around that time. So you have these very large blockbuster movies like Naya Daur, which is talking about this incessant conflict between new technology and people who want to stick to romantic old ways. The conflict that comes when machine comes over to replace human labor. That idea of that conflict is handled so very beautifully in that movie, where a tanga is racing against a car, and in a metaphor of how the world is changing and where labor economics is leading us to, or labor laws are leading us to. A spate of films follow. Adalat is another major movie made at that time, which is really looking at judicial issues and how law reform and judicial reform must accompany economic reform. This is again a running theme that you see across Hindi cinema, where you see movies made in the courtroom discussing legal issues that become the foundation of a strong economy. You have a major film like Damini, which is exclusively and entirely built upon the issue of delays in justice and delays in the court system. You then have movies that contest the rights of common citizens, the right to compensation, the right to a decent wage, and an entire set of films that test the law on evidence. So that's one issue of liberalism that we see argued out in movies on where they are talking about law and law reform. But going back to the 50s and the 60s, what were the economic issues that were paramount at that time? The major issue at that time was famine. And you have a set of movies that look at what happens during famine. These movies are looking at the issue of drought and famine very sensitively, while being extremely clinical and practical about the solutions. Films that are called Roti Kapda or Makan, where the issue of food price inflation is brought up. There is a constant refrain in the songs in those movies about how Mehngai, which is inflation, is a killer disease and what ought to be done about it. There are movies then that talk about the entire manner in which India's foreign policy is being shaped, what is happening with the question of non-alignment. There are movies that are talking about India-China relationships and how that is becoming the leading source of optimism on one hand and of great challenges ahead on the other. The issue of war, which is also something that is a difficult issue to take up in popular cinema, is taken up in a big way when we have movies that are made on war. War itself is a concept that Hindi cinema handles rather interestingly and in a most liberal framework. It is not mere jingoism that you see. In fact, what you see in Hindi cinema at the time when India is fighting major wars against China and Pakistan is strangely advocating or movies that advocate and argue for peace. In each of those movies that are made, whether it is Haqiqat or whether it is the Devanand set of films on war, the running reframe seems to be that peace is far more important than war is, that the economic issues are bigger than issues of jingoism and uber patriotism. So that is the setting of a liberal agenda of India 50, 60 years ago. An India that is beginning to look at a future where the Indian economy matters, where issues of scarcity, issues of resource allocation, and issues of poverty are being handled. You have a set of movies that are then made in the 60s that address the issue of poverty in a most liberal fashion. The movies that come to mind are movies like Do Bigha Zameen, Ganga Jamna, which are movies that talk about the pressures of poverty on rural life and the kind of reaction that the protagonists and other characters have when faced with acute hunger or poverty or the sense of missing out on livelihoods. It is really revealing that these filmmakers are are making heroes out of people who fight adversity at a most basic level. Mother India is another movie where the juxtaposition of poverty, a struggle against circumstances, issue of what is right and wrong, of maternal love, of sibling rivalry, everything is taken up in a manner that is completely underlined by an understanding of a spirit that is progressive, a spirit that is modern, and something that looks at handling conflict in a manner that is ethically right. The world of the 70s and 80s is a different world, and Hindi cinema looks at it differently too. This world is a world where a generation of people who have lived in India pre-independence are giving way to a set of people who are getting increasingly frustrated with conflicting issues that face them in the economy. This is marked by some giant stars who question the establishment, who question the very existence and the very nature of the country, who are questioning patriarchal values, who are questioning authority, and therefore are redefining the liberal. The liberal now is the liberal who is ready to go out there and articulate her frustration and articulate the fact that I do not agree with what has been going on for 100 of years. So there is outburst against the parent, the stern father, exhibited when Dilip Kumar stares at this monarch, this giant, huge, unassailable Jalaluddin Akbar, and dares him. You have Amitabh Bachchan, who is fighting against his father in a complete outburst against patriarchy and supporting his mother. You have a series of films that question caste, that question differences, and notice the fact that in the period of the 70s and 80s, as the world is getting technologically advanced and India is now grappling with various kinds of conflicts, Hindi cinema again in some ways remains ahead of the curve and brings out these challenges and these questions out in the open. Again, this is what liberal philosophy is all about, or liberalism is about, which is to look at the conflicts that might arise and talk about them openly, even if they seem wrong, even if it appears as if they are questioning past ideals. In fact, what is interesting to note is that Hindi cinema takes a leaf out of the popular culture of the play and the skit in India. The 19th century playwrights who wrote a lot of literature in Persian and Urdu were those who actually were the standard bearers of liberalism. They were even then questioning old ideas. Even when they were writing about mythology or mythological characters, they were taking them up as people who stood up against injustice. And that is what you see in the 70s and 80s. In the 90s comes a wave of change, and cinema also becomes light-hearted, becomes jovial, starts looking at minor issues, starts reveling in technology, in the fast pace of change that post-liberalization India shows us. And here is where you see the modern actors, the big actors like Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan come up, who are now singing their way out of trouble, who know what the right answers are, who are equally comfortable in domestic and international surroundings, who have no problems in looking at difficult issues and addressing them upfront, and who are also in their own way striking at the root of what would constitute the new illiberal. In this, what one must not ignore is the fact that there is a strand of cinema, and it would be wrong to ignore it at all. That is actually going back to being illiberal. That is actually feeding off old patriarchy. You have television that comes up at that time, which is actually taking 10 steps backward and extolling the virtues of a patriarchal society, or of a society that believes in pure tradition that can often come in the way of progress. There are strands that you see in cinema that actually make us aware of the fact that the illiberal or the non-liberal is still alive. This is cinema that celebrates slapstick comedy, that celebrates the deformity, that laughs at people who are different, that finds escape in xenophobia. So you have examples of that kind of cinema too, and it's interesting to look at that to understand how a society like India, a complex society like India, which is in a lot of ways traditional and illiberal, is ready to embrace a medium that stands exactly opposing the values that are transferred to them. So you have cinema like Shalimar or Kala or Gora, where there is a strong racist element, where if you are black then you are bad, or you are somebody to laugh at. You have a number of movies made with Govinda as the hero, where if you are fat or if you are rural, then you are supposed to be laughed at. So there is a strand of such kind of cinema also that we see. And Well, that is the kind of society we are in, and that's the kind of medium that Hindi cinema is, which is that despite being a very iconoclastic medium, where brave new cinema makers are striking out, are looking at making brave cinema, there are also simple old writers who are feeding off what is mainstream, of what they think is mainstream. What is interesting, and that is how I want to end this talk, is to see what is happening now. If you see cinema, again, Hindi cinema is ahead of the curve. You find that even before this kind of illiberal uber nationalism comes into the body politic of the country, you have cinema that withdraws. You have a set of films that are aggressive, that are harnessing this growing sense of alienation against the foreigner, that are celebrating a cricket match that a bunch of fellows win against the whites, that are celebrating a superhero who goes and bashes up hundreds of people in Pakistan. And therefore you find that even a few years before we see such kind of nationalism being played out on the political field, you have it coming in cinema. And that is one thing that most people should watch out for, that just as cinema led a new country into a revolutionary modern era 70 years ago, here you have that same cinema, or strands of that same cinema, trying to feed into the kind of uber nationalism and the kind of xenophobia that we see around in society today. However, the the innate nature of art comes through, and art and artists, even in today's age and world, will find their ways of defining what liberalism means. And you see a bunch of new filmmakers who are coming in and questioning basic issues. You have now in the cinema looking at people who are differently able. You have cinema celebrating people who have different sexual preferences. You have cinema that is scoffing at protectionism and at inward-looking politicians. I am always reminded of one movie which I want to, which in my opinion is a movie that best exemplifies this entire debate of the liberal versus the illiberal, of the global versus the local, of protectionism versus globalization. This was a cinema that was called Gupt. This was a movie made about 20 years ago, and in this movie there is a debate that is at the center of the entire plot. In this debate, two sets of politicians are arguing for what their vision of India is. One set is looking inwards. It is talking about why we should shut off foreign investment, why we should not allow technology to come in, and why we should remain a protected economy. The other set, which is new, is talking about science, progress, foreign investment, exports, and talking about the opening up of an economy that must now look beyond its borders to grow and to solve the pernicious problem of unemployment and poverty. This is the debate that starts off in Hindi cinema uh, 2 decades before we come back to that same debate in the public sphere. You will find several such instances in a bunch of movies made, and not just in Hindi. I am taking examples from Hindi cinema because I am very familiar with that. The other cinema I am familiar with is Telugu, and in Telugu cinema too, from the days of Maya Bazaar to today, you will find that here is this brave set of people who are ready to look at issues completely differently. The I think that the most important thing that happened to Hindi cinema, and the reason it was the forerunner and the harbinger of liberalism in the country, was that Hindi cinema always had people from the outsides. It was a bunch of people who were not necessarily an elite that was bound by by some kind of rigid principles of or history or mythology. It was a bunch of unknown people who came together to bring to us an art that was not constrained by any idea, and they had to to utilize the new medium and to capture attention of the masses. They had to look at issues in a manner that is necessarily rebellious, that is necessarily iconoclastic, and that is what you see, and that is why we define Hindi cinema and Indian cinema as being one of the most liberal mediums that we've ever had. Look at how Indian cinema looks at business. Even from the very beginning, and this maybe has to do with the fact that it is Indian business that has almost always supported and funded Indian cinema. It has been India's private sector business that has funded Indian cinema from its first days. Indian cinema looks at India's business sector very kindly. Even when we had crony capitalism at its worst, even when we had very unethical, very corrupt businessmen, Indian cinema tends to understate that. It is when the government gets in and you have funding coming in from resources that are not really corporate that you have some hard-hitting films looking at the corporate sector very harshly. The cinema that is that even the cinema that is center left, you will find question the capitalist world, does question harsh uses of money, but does it in a very romantic manner. One film that stands out in this is a film called Namak Haram, where Rajesh Khanna and Amitabh Bachchan are fighting about the very issues of who owns capital and how capital is used to exploit the worker and what it means to be where one is with respect to this debate. So you will find that in terms of Indian business, a cinema that first looks kindly at India's businesses, then extols the virtues of the public sector. Mother India pays a tribute to the building of dams, and then goes on to celebrate entrepreneurship, new wealth in movies that follow later on, even to the extent of talking about startups and what they mean to a new economy. Even in this treatment of business, you will find that Indian cinema looks at business in a very forward-looking and progressive manner. You will also see that because the structure of making Indian cinema or Indian cinema change, you find that a large number of filmmakers and film writers are no longer affiliated to certain sections of society that earn money through dubious means, and therefore they are in that sense far more confident. The budgets are bigger, the funding is easier to get, and therefore spending large amounts of money is no longer as difficult as it used to be. On the other hand, what you have is a set of filmmakers who are coming in with small amounts of money, huge amounts of creativity. And I must mention people like Nagesh Kukunur and Zoya Akhtar and whatever, who come in with just bright ideas that define a liberal spirit, that define modernism, that doesn't really care for the political environment in which their stories are located. They are just looking and celebrating the human spirit in its entirety and in its freedom. You see that happening so many times in so many movies. Indian cinema, like all other industry, has gone through this stage of being completely unorganized and informal to now being half organized and half informal. So now you have fund sources of funds that are not entirely borrowed from friends and family or clearly from illegal means. You have a lot of cinema makers who are raising genuine funds from capital markets. What does it do? On one hand, it brings up a cleaner environment around the studios. On the other hand, it might be stifling some creativity, and that is one refrain that you often hear, that because it is the large corporate that has taken over the cinema industry, cinema also has to kowtow to the establishment, and therefore must show what the running government or the running system wants it to show. It has therefore both its sides. You certainly have cinema today that seems to be going the way big electronic media is going, in terms of not being able to question establishment at all. And but at that same time, you do have people who are ready, in the good old liberal spirit, to be anti-establishment, to understand that all good art is art that questions authority, and therefore we will see this duality exist. We will see some cinema that is unashamedly pro-establishment, and you will see cinema that is bravely questioning authority. The future of Hindi cinema, or the future of Indian cinema, what does that look like? It is but obvious that cinema, like it has always been, will be slightly ahead of its times. So, therefore, in cinema, we will see the changes that we will see in India 10 years from now. Can already see that happening. There is a restlessness among the youth about careers, about jobs. There is a restlessness about existing ideologies that constrain thinking. There is a hint of a rebellion against authoritarianism. And I think that is going to be the feature of new cinema, which will strike at the root of the illiberal elements that seep into a society that starts looking at authoritarianism as a virtue. And that is why Hindi cinema too will have these little vents that will allow people to express their doubts about where we are going. That is the kind of cinema that I expect will happen. Small, simple, uh, questioning elements from common people who will wonder why Indian society becomes illiberal when it has been among the most liberal societies for a number of decades.